Should you play Righteous Fire Juggernaut in Trial of the Ancestors? The build got no significant changes from last league, so if you liked it in Crucible, you can absolutely play it again. And if you've been eyeing the build for a while, maybe you saw it in Crucible and said, not this time. Or you saw it in Forbidden Sanctum and said, I don't think it's good for the league mechanic. Maybe you saw it in Lake of Kalandra, but then didn't play Lake of Kalandra. Or saw it in Sentinel, but got distracted by recombinators. Well, now's as good a time as any to play Righteous Fire Juggernaut. It's a very cozy build, and it has plenty of damage to map smoothly, with only a little bit of investment. I played it as my Crucible League starter, and took it all the way from day 1 to Uber bosses. More accurately, I have a video on day 3, a video approximately around day 7, and then a full min-maxed version. I also have several supplementary resources like some early game tips and tricks, and a crafting guide to get the gear. But if you need even more than that, I have a full written guide over on Maxroll. Now, to be clear, my guide is not intended to be a league starter, that's just what I did with the build. And speaking of, here's a few things about early league that I'd like to talk about. Number 1, 4th Vow could be more popular this league than it was last league, which means there might be more competition and thus more expense. Furthermore, Glorious Vanity could be more expensive as a result of the changes to 5-ways. If these two items are more expensive, then just go for Brass Dome, which is exactly what I did early last league anyway. Now, when going through your early league gearing, look for the following items. Death Rush, because it feels great when mapping. You get Life on Kill, which sustains your life very easily. Adrenaline, which provides defenses, speed, and damage. And a little bit of Chaos Res, which is much needed early on. You'll also want to target a Legacy of Fury as soon as possible. This tends to start a bit more on the expensive side, being 2 or 3 Divines. But it's a pretty common drop from Maven, so the price will drop quickly. What this gives you is a pseudo-explodey effect, causing nearby enemies to burn their friends when killed. So if you're playing this early in a league, don't worry about the 2-mod Watcher's Eye. Don't worry about the Oriath's End. And if you want extra defenses or damage, maybe you look around for a cheap 2 to 3 Divine Flesh and Flame. Prices on those are wildly unstable, and sometimes you get lucky and grab a good deal. If you want to know more about how I crafted some of my gear, then do be sure to check out my crafting video after this one. Or of course, read all about it over on the Maxroll guide. But now, let's get into more information on how I played the build. First up, it's important to remember that you need to cap your fire resistance. Not only is Righteous Fire constantly burning you to death, but the Fire Mastery grants you more life regeneration based on your total, i.e. uncapped fire res. You'll want to do this as quickly as possible and also pick up the Vitality Aura. The higher your max res, the less damage you take from Righteous Fire. And with higher regeneration, number 1, you can start ignoring the self-damage from RF entirely, which you should do really before swapping to it. Number 2, you can recover from enemy hits faster, and number 3, you can ignore enemy degens and dots. Another important stat leveraged by the build is damage shifting, also known as damage taken as. Now the biggest source of this is the Glorious Vanity node Divine Flesh, causing 50% of elemental damage to be taken as chaos. However, you can also find it on helmets as either an Eldritch Implicit or Explicit mod. Typically, I wouldn't advise this since your helmet should be used for damage, but you can, especially very early on. Another way to get it is the Armor and Energy Shield Mastery, 10% of physical damage from hits is taken as chaos, or the Taste of Hate Flask. These are all good ways to not only increase your defenses, but make your armor far more efficient. And once you get 4th Vow, your armor applies to chaos damage, allowing it to double dip. Another question that I got a few times when playing RF, should I have my Righteous Fire in my helmet or my chest piece, and where does my fire trap go? Realistically, your Righteous Fire can be in your helmet, chest piece, or even a pair of essence-rolled gloves. That depends on number 1, do you need more clear speed? Number 2, do you need more single target damage? And number 3, what are the options available? If all 3 are 4 links, put it in anything. If you have a 6 link and a 4 link, well, if you're struggling for clear, you want to put your Righteous Fire in the 6 link. This will limit your single target DPS. Or if you're struggling for single target, you want to put Fire Trap there, but remember your Righteous Fire's clear will be limited as a result. In general, the standard setup is a Horror Helmet for a pseudo 6 or 7 link, and a 6 link chest piece. And on the note of maximizing damage, don't be afraid to pick up either a Minion Wand or a Dagger instead of a Scepter. While Scepters are your best in slot when min-maxed, Elemental Overload has higher uptime if you have higher crit chance, so a Dagger isn't terrible provided you have the stats to wield it. And if you have enough intelligence for a Minion Wand, through Spiritual Aid you're going to be applying that to all of your damage anyway. The reason you don't use a regular wand is because Righteous Fire is non-ailment fire damage over time. It doesn't scale off of spell damage, and it doesn't scale off of flat added damage to spells. so wands are not good for this build. But with that said, if you get a fractured, well-rolled wand, don't be afraid to use that either. Use the best weapon you've got, and always fix it later. And speaking of ailments, Purity of Elements is really helpful early on. Not only does it make it easy to cap your resistances, but it renders you completely immune to all elemental ailments. So you can't get shocked, take a bunch of damage, and die. You don't get frozen and locked out of moving, and you don't have your resistances lowered, which might end up in you burning to death. On a higher budget, you could also switch to the Storm Shroud Unique Jewel and work in another damage aura, but Purity of Elements is a very cost-efficient solution. Storm Shroud usually costs a couple divines, and you need Essence of Torment on either your boots, if you're not using Legacy of Fury, or alternatively on your belt, because you'll need a 100% chance to avoid being shocked in order to enable Storm Shroud's effect. And so, those are just a few of the key mechanics that you should keep in mind when playing a Righteous Fire Juggernaut. In terms of farming strategies, I really like stuff like White Map Beast farming, Expedition, Essence, Delving, Eldritch Altars, and of course Harvest. Though if you want to do Alkin Go or Blight, that's fine too. I did a little bit of heisting, and you can even fight pinnacle bosses. Do things like invitation runs, though I wouldn't advise Uber bosses unless you're really geared. So now let's get into the tree, skills, and items. Or at least all the items I haven't covered in detail already. So here we have the passive tree I used for my Righteous Fire Juggernaut. First up, if you're wondering, why versatility when you don't use accuracy? Movement speed's always good, and it's a great way to get additional dexterity and intelligence. If you solve this by another means, you can absolutely drop these points, but as you can see, I haven't done that, so versatility it is. Next up, I'm pathing over to Prismatic Skin because I want as many additional resistances as possible. Then, pathing through Armor Mastery for even more resists, and coming up here, where I place my Cluster Jewel. If this is a late addition to your build, then feel free to get other damage nodes, such as coming over to Heart of Flame. If you don't have Glorious Vanity, you don't really need to come over here either. And while this node is very nice, often giving you a way to get additional damage or defenses on your build, without the Thread of Hope, you don't need to worry about it. Similarly, Avatar of Fire is specifically there to convert the explosions from Oriath's End. If you don't have a flask, you don't need that either. Though, unless you're using a Brass Dome, I would highly advise coming over to Sanctum of Thought for the 30% reduced extra damage from critical strikes. You really want the Armor and Energy Shield mastery either way, so it's a pretty point-efficient thing. Though if you have Brass Dome, you can grab Faith and Steel instead, which does apply some elemental resistances as well. Then we take Divine Judgment, because it's a really efficient way to get elemental damage. Sovereignty, to use all the auras. Another Cluster Jewel, because who doesn't want damage? And last but not least, Elemental Overload plus Acrimony and pathing all the way over to Breath of Flames. Now, Elemental Overload is a pretty significant chunk of damage, but not mandatory for the build. It's only about 8.6% total DPS. This is because it applies to the Ignite from your Fire Trap, which isn't insignificant, it's doing over 1 million DPS, but not the Burning Ground. Watch, the Ignite goes down by a significant margin, but the Burning Ground doesn't change. This is why your endgame weapon isn't ever going to be a dagger. And so, that's about it for the tree on Righteous Fire Jugg. Feel free to pick up extra damage or extra defenses, especially before your Cluster Jewels, as you feel is necessary. Coming over to skills, Righteous Fire, that is my 6th link. Linked up to Efficacy, Life Tap is there to enable the duration tag for things like Awaken Swift Affliction. Burning Damage is good, and Elemental Focus is good, and the non-awakened versions of these gems would be quite useful as well. For Fire Trap, you've got, well, Fire Trap itself, Life Tap, Trap in Mine, Awaken Swift Affliction, because it's in my helmet. A couple other things to call out are Awaken Controlled Destruction, and Empower, because Fire Trap scales pretty well off of gem levels. These are both alternatives, and it'll just depend on the price. While you can use Cruelty at low levels, I would not suggest doing so at high levels. You simply don't hit hard enough. And if you go with a setup that spends mana, you could use Inspiration to reduce the cost, but Life Tap simplifies things so much that there's no reason to go Inspiration instead. Now for auras, I'm running Malevolence, Determination, and Purity of Elements, keeping it simple and saving costs on the Storm Shroud setup. Enduring Cry is a great way to get an extra burst of healing. Life Tap it, of course, because spending mana is lame, though if you don't mind spending mana and want to go faster, just toss in a Momentum support. This will apply specifically to your shield charge and allow you to use it more efficiently. But I don't tend to use shield charge that much, I mostly just Frostblink from pack to pack, If you can pick up a Divergent early, that's great, but it's not mandatory for the build. Also, this build uses flammability, but when you can afford it, you'll definitely want to go dual curse. This most likely means anointing Whispers of Doom and dropping Charisma. But that's something that you'd only be able to do after you've already gotten the Storm Shroud set up. And last but not least, of course, a nice defensive setup with cast on damage taken Molten Shell. Feel free to adjust these to comfort. Just keep in mind that if the level requirement, which right now is 36 on Molten Shell, ever goes above cast on damage taken, it won't trigger anymore. If a higher level of a cast on damage taken, the more damage required to trigger. So this, 111, doesn't work, but 110 does. Now coming over to items, we've got the Havoc Roar, a fractured damage over time multiplier scepter, rolled with essences for minion damage. This doesn't have to be fractured dot multi. It could also be fractured burning damage, fractured fire damage. If it was fire damage, you'd of course roll it differently because you can't have both fire damage and minion damage. Fractured fire dot multi, fractured all spell, or fractured fire spell. Start with any fractured base that has a relevant mod, and craft the item around it. That means using minion essences for most things, and if you happen to get the fractured fire damage on a really high roll, you can instead use fossils, roll for fire mods, and hope you get lucky. For your shield, Sappho's Frame is a really good early item, or any shield with life. A little crit chance for spells isn't bad, assuming that you're using EO and getting relevant damage from it. Not very important to the build though. +1 to level of all fire spell skill gems, and 34% to fire resistance. Just so happens if you use fossils that say fire damage, you'll roll those mods a lot, and it's a really efficient way to craft a shield. In general, try to get fire spell skill gems and increased fire damage. On a life base, don't worry about the rest. For your helmet, this is crafted with Essence of Horror. I happen to have a really good one in here because I made it and I'm proud of it. Yours does not need to be this good. Just roll with an Essence of Horror until you get either burning damage or concentrated effect. And then craft life, Fizz taken as, plus AoE gems, whatever suits you. Just keep in mind that if you put your Righteous Fire in with concentrated effect, the AoE will get much smaller, so in that case, I'd advise Fire Trap. For your chest piece, I advise Fourth Vow. You can instead use Brass Dome, or a rare chest crafted with Essence of Loathing for extra mana reservation efficiency. The best way to get gloves like this early on is to use Rog. He's pretty darn good at elevating modifiers, so if it has life regeneration rate, life, armor, some resist, he'll bring all of those up to 6 times tier 1. And most likely you won't need something strictly this good. The life regeneration rate is absolutely not mandatory, nor is the armor prefixes. They're really nice, and I'm glad I have them, but you could easily use something else and not really notice the difference. Good resist suffixes and crafted life, you'll be a happy camper. Just try to get the fire dot multi and fire exposure. Then Legacy of Fury, the Maven Boots, these scorch enemies, and greatly accelerate your clear. For your amulet, look for plus to level of all fire skill gems, fire dot multi, damage over time multi, or plus to level of all skill gems. Try to craft life and hope there's a resist or some attributes. On your ring, solve problems. The problem could be that you're missing chaos res, the problem could be you're missing dexterity. Whatever you're missing, get it on a ring. Rog is great for crafting the suffixes, and then you can do something like suffixes can't be changed, veiled chaos to get life as a prefix. Block mana before you unveil it. For your other ring, I strongly advise Death Rush. It's not required, but it does feel really good, and getting the adrenaline makes mapping super smooth. There's 2 different ways to make a belt like this, and don't worry about the increased life from the Hunter mod. That's definitely icing on the cake here. But getting life and life regen is incredibly powerful. One method is covered in my crafting guide that I'll link down below, and the other is in my Maxwell guide under the belt crafting. So do whichever one makes the most economical sense in the economy currently. On a searching eye jewel, look for stats that are relevant. If you need intelligence, dex, try to grab those. Life is always good, and increased damage over time does help a little bit for DPS. An eye jewel is also a good way to get corrupted blood immunity. The Orieth's End could very easily be Taste of Hate instead. It's a quite good option that's, well, a little bit less expensive, let's say. You want a Ruby Flask for extra fire damage mitigation and recovery via resistance, and then the Quicksilver Flask to help zoom. For Cluster Jewels, in most cases, it's easier to buy them than roll them yourself. Same with regular jewels, and like I mentioned, the Watcher's Eye is optional, same with a Thread of Hope, just adjust your build around it. And so hopefully that answers most, if not all of your questions about playing a Righteous Fire Juggernaut in Path of Exile 3.22. Keep in mind that this is without the changes that are specific to Trial of the Ancestors. There's a lot of new skill tattoos coming, things like Flask Effect Duration, Fire Resistance, even Mana Reservation Efficiency, and all of these can be used to optimize the build. If you see a use for it, such as putting in a Nightmare Jewel and gaining Spell Suppression Cap or Block Cap, then absolutely include it in your build. Just because I've created a really effective framework here doesn't mean you should be too afraid to experiment. It just means you should know what you're getting into when you do, because it's quite easy to break things and gear's often in a delicate balance. Even something simple like fitting in a Storm Shroud may require you to shift several pieces of gear. And I do think, in particular, you should look to convert at least some of the strength nodes available to the build, because you have quite a lot of them and you don't need all of them for your max life. Though I wouldn't convert too many of them because yes, you do lose max life for each one you convert. And hey, maybe you grab a few extra attributes on your amulet, your rings, or cluster jewels, and convert some of that spare intelligence from up near the witch area over to something else interesting as well. If you already have a really solid Righteous Fire Juggernaut League start plan picked out and you're looking to transition the build into something else, this could very well be the way to do it. But now I'm curious, what cool things do you think the skill tattoos will enable? And which one of them will be best on Righteous Fire Juggernaut? Leave your speculation down in the comments below. Or I guess if you're watching this video after the league comes out, leave some of your experiences down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. That said, if you're looking for something else to watch, I've got enough Righteous Fire to fill the rest of your day. I have a tips and tricks video, a full crafting guide, my day 3 experiences, my week 1-ish experiences, and the full min-max version of my Righteous Fire build. You can find all of those up in the card and down in the description below, or another recommendation on the screen right now if you're still hungry for more and you've seen all of those videos. Or again, you can always read the full guide over at MaxrollGG. With that said, thank you for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. Link to that is down below. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, maybe leave a like, and don't forget to get subscribed so that you won't miss my next upload. With that said, thanks for watching, hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.